Yo, what's good, guys? So we're back with episode number 2 of our C++ series. So really quickly, we're going to cover data types. So here's all the data types that I use pretty often. Um, so first we have our primitive types, which have a green dash pound. We have int, char, double, float. An int is just an integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to infinity. And then char is just one single character, meaning A or B or C, something like that. And a character could also be other things other than letters. And then a string is a bunch of characters put together. And this isn't a primitive type. It's you have to include the class hashtag include string. So yeah, it's not a primitive type. Moving on, double is just a long version of float. They're both decimals, but float can have like 7 decimal places and double can have like 16 or something like that. And then an array is just a like a container of a bunch of different types of a bunch of different elements that have the same type. So we can have an array, so a container that's just like, so if this is an array of ints, we could have like 1, 3, 2, 5, whatever we want. But the thing with arrays are they're static, or yeah, they're static. So you have to define the size. With vectors, they're the same thing. They're just a container that can contain multiple variables, but they can increase in size or decrease in size. So if we have like the same thing, 3, 2, 5, and we want to add something to it, we can do that during runtime with vectors. So we can just change it to like 1, 3, 2, 5, and then I don't know, 6. And then we talked about classes and structs last time, but they're called abstract data types, or ADTs for short. And classes and structs we'll talk about in their own separate video, but these are really, really fundamental to object-oriented programming, which is used in so many industries within computer science. The first thing that pops into my head is gaming. When people develop games, they use classes so much. At least that's what I've heard. I'm not a game developer or anything. Okay, so here I'm in Visual Studio 2019. We'll have a video to show how to install this. So we're just gonna exemplify all of these data types. Up here we have our libraries included. If you don't know what any of this means, don't worry about it. We'll cover it later. Also with the namespaces, we'll cover that later. It just makes it easier for me to write code. And then main function. Every program has to have a main function. That's how the executable file knows where to start. The main file is where your program starts. So here you can see we declared and initialized all of the data types that I talked about. So we have a integer, a character, a string, a double, a float, and then we have an array, a vector. So up here, as you can see, I had to include string and vector because they're not primitive types. With primitive types, we can just declare them without having to include anything. So I set num to 1, character to A, string to howdy, and then the decimals I set to whatever that is, like a really small decimal. And then the array, as you can see, I had to set its size. If I just left this blank, it would give me an error. So I just made it size 10, so we can have up to 10 elements in this container. So I listed 1 through 10, just to make it simple. And then vector, this is how you declare a vector. You say vector, and then you put in angular braces the type that you want to keep in the container, and then the name. And notice how for all of these data types and variables, I had to define a name for it. That's pretty important and pretty obvious. And then one function for the vectors that we'll learn about later is pushback. This just means that you're pushing whatever's in the parentheses into the container. Since vectors are dynamic and they can increase or decrease, we're putting this into the container. That's the pushback. And then cout is just a way for us to print it to the console. So as you can see, I'm just printing all the information up here, and Now we're going to compile this. And in Visual Studio, you just click this button here, Local Windows Debugger, and if there's something wrong with your code, it'll tell you and it won't execute. But if everything's good, what's going to happen is what we talked about in the first video. It's going to be compiled into assembly, and then from there it's going to be assembled into machine language binary. So let's go ahead and click this. And I already checked that it's working, just for time's sake. And once it's finished here, we'll see all of the information. So we have 1a howdy 5 to the negative 17th, 5 times 10 to the negative 17th. Yeah, that's the same thing. Don't worry about it. We'll talk about how to fix that and put it in decimal notation later. And then we printed here with this for loop. We'll talk about that. Don't worry about it. But this is like one of the most important loops you'll learn, the for loop. We're basically just going through the array 10 times and printing out whatever's in that index. So here's that. And then we only have one element in our vector, but if we had two, it would print out two. But we don't. But it did what it's supposed to. It printed out two. And then what's nice in Visual Studio 2019 is it pauses the program for you. If you're running 2017 version of Visual Studio, it won't do this. When you run it, it will just close the window, and that's not very good. So you'll have to come down here and type system parentheses quotes and then pause semicolon. And that's another thing. Every line is or every instruction is stopped with a semicolon. So the computer could read all of this on one line. Like if I put everything on one line, it could read it as long as we had the semicolons. So yeah, that's the basic data types. And we'll get into classes and structs down the line, but that's a little bit more advanced. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.